The North Atlantic, 1943. A steel gray, sea churns under a sky the color of a bruise. On the deck of a Liberty ship, a young sailor pulls his collar tight against a wind that feels like it's laced with ice. Below him, thousands of tons of steel groan as the ship plows through the waves, a vital artery carrying fuel, ammunition, and hope from America to a war-torn Britain. The men are tense. It's not the German U-boats they fear most on this stretch of water. It's something far more sinister. It's the invisible killer of the Atlantic. Suddenly, a colossal geyser of water erupts from the ocean, not 50 yards from the ship's bow. The concussion hits a moment later, a physical blow that throws men from their feet. There was no torpedo trail, no periscope, no warning. Another ship in their convoy, a freighter just like theirs, has simply vanished, replaced by a pillar of fire and smoke. It never touched a thing. The terror of the German magnetic mine was its silence, its patience. A ship didn't need to strike it. It only had to pass nearby. Its own steel hull, a massive magnet gliding through the water, would become its executioner, waking the beast sleeping on the seabed below. For the Allied sailors, it was a ghost they couldn't fight, a death that came from nowhere. The ocean itself had been weaponized against them. But across that same ocean, in the controlled chaos of the Brooklyn Navy Yard, a different kind of war was being waged. Here, the air didn't smell of salt and fear, but of hot rivets, welding ozone, and industrial-grade paint. It was a symphony of American might, the roar of cranes and the hiss of acetylene torches creating the very ships that were being hunted in the Atlantic. And in the heart of this industrial storm stood one man who was about to prove that the most powerful weapon in this new kind of war wasn't a bigger gun or a faster ship. It was a simple can of paint. On June 13, 1943, the air inside a conference room at the Brooklyn Navy Yard was thick with skepticism. James Franklin Morrison, a 51-year-old civilian industrial painter, stood before a panel of stern-faced United States Navy officers. He was a man more comfortable in grease-stained overalls than a pressed shirt, his hands calloused from 22 years of fighting rust, not Nazis. On the polished mahogany table before him sat a single, unremarkable can of dark gray paint. To the decorated men in the room, it was an absurdity. They were fighting a technological war of unprecedented scale, and this man was offering a solution that belonged in a hardware store. Admiral Harold Thompson, commander of the Naval Sea Systems Command, leaned forward, his uniform creaking, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His voice was a low growl, honed by years of command. "Let me get this straight, Mr. Morrison," he began, his eyes narrowing. "You expect us to believe that common paint can stop the most advanced German magnetic mines?" The words dripped with condescension. Morrison, unfazed, placed a steady hand on the can. "It's not common paint, Admiral," he replied, his voice calm and even, a stark contrast to the tension in the room. "It's a suspension of micronized iron oxide particles in a modified epoxy resin, bonded with graphite compounds." The technical jargon did little to impress them. A few officers exchanged dismissive glances. They were engineers and strategists, men of science and battle, and they were losing a war at sea to an invisible enemy. They had thrown the full might of their engineering prowess at the problem, and this painter was talking about pigments and resins. But what these brilliant men didn't know was that Morrison wasn't just a painter. He was a father, and for the last 8 months, he had been consumed by a problem that the Navy's best and brightest, with all their university degrees in advanced physics, couldn't solve. He was fighting a secret, desperate war in his own garage, driven by a fear more powerful than any military directive. He was trying to save his son. If you want to know how a single can of paint, born from father's love, became one of World War II's greatest secret weapons, type Brooklyn in the comments below. Every comment helps the algorithm share these incredible, forgotten stories of American ingenuity with more people. The weapon that haunted James Morrison's waking thoughts and sleepless nights was the German Luftmine B, or LMB. Dropped by aircraft into the shipping lanes, These mines were a marvel of sinister engineering. Unlike the old contact mines that had to be physically struck by a ship, the LMB was a patient predator. It lay dormant on the seabed, waiting. Inside its casing was a device called a magnetic influence fuse, a needle delicately balanced within a magnetic field. Any large steel object passing overhead, like the 7,000-ton hull of a Liberty ship, would disturb the Earth's natural magnetic field. The needle would dip, completing an electrical circuit. The result was over 1,500 pounds of high explosives detonating directly beneath the ship's keel, where the armor was thinnest. The blast would break the ship's back, sending it and its crew to the bottom in minutes. The numbers were catastrophic. Between January and May of 1943 alone, these silent killers had sunk or crippled 47 Allied vessels in the North Atlantic. 1,823 sailors were dead, with another 2,176 wounded. The vital supply convoy routes, the lifeline to Great Britain and the future invasion of Europe, were being slowly strangled. The U.S. Navy was not idle. Their engineers had proposed and tested solution after solution, each more complex and expensive than the last. Their primary method was called degaussing. They wrapped massive electrical cables around the entire hull of a ship, running a current through them to create an opposing magnetic field that would, in theory, cancel out the ship's own signature. But in practice, it was a clumsy and imperfect fix. The result? It reduced the magnetic signature by only 40%. It wasn't enough. The mines were still detonating. Their second attempt was brute force. They tried adding additional shielding made of non-magnetic steel to critical areas of the hull. The result was a logistical nightmare. It added nearly 20 tons of extra weight to a transport ship, cutting its top speed by 12%. A slower ship was an easier target for the U-boat wolf packs that prowled the same waters. The solution to one problem made them more vulnerable to another. Finally, in desperation, they simply tried to go around the problem. They altered shipping routes to avoid known minefields. The result? Each convoy crossing took an extra 4 to 6 days. Food, fuel, and ammunition arrived late. On the battlefronts of Europe and North Africa, Allied troops suffered shortages, all because of a weapon they couldn't see. By March of 1943, Admiral Ernest King, the formidable commander-in-chief of the U.S. fleet, issued a classified directive that crackled with urgency. Find an effective solution to the magnetic mine threat. Maximum priority. James Morrison never saw that top-secret directive. He didn't have clearance. He didn't have a degree in physics. But he had something far more valuable, something that focused his mind with a terrifying clarity, a son serving in the Merchant Marine. Junior Lieutenant Robert Morrison was 24 years old, an officer on the Liberty ship SS John W. Brown, sailing the deadliest route in the world. In February of 1943, his ship had a brush with death. It passed within 165 feet of a German magnetic mine. For some reason, a faulty fuse, a stroke of pure luck, the mine detonated prematurely. The blast was still powerful enough to cripple the ship's rudder, but it survived. When the damaged SS John W. Brown limped back to the Brooklyn Navy Yard for repairs in March, Robert visited his father. The conversation they had amidst the clangor of the shipyard would alter the course of the war. Morrison saw the haunted look in his son's eyes, a shadow that hadn't been there before. "Dad," Robert said, his voice low, "the Germans, they have these mines that explode without even touching you. They can feel the ship's steel. The boys are terrified. There's no way to know where they are until one goes off right under you." Morrison felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He put a hand on his son's shoulder. "What's the Navy doing to stop them?" "They're installing these degaussing coils," Robert explained, shaking his head. "But they don't work well enough. The mines still hear us coming." That night, Morrison didn't sleep. He lay awake, staring into the darkness, the image of his son's ship being torn apart by an invisible force playing over and over in his mind. He wasn't a naval engineer. He had no formal training in electromagnetic physics. but he was a master of his craft. For 22 years, he had been applying industrial coatings designed to protect steel from the ravages of corrosion, extreme heat, and mechanical stress. And he knew something that the physicists in their clean laboratories didn't. He knew his materials. He knew that certain metallic compounds, when suspended in just the right way, could do strange things. They could interfere with, absorb, and disrupt electromagnetic fields. This was Brooklyn chemistry versus German engineering, and the fight was about to begin in a cluttered garage. For the next 3 weeks, Morrison's garage became a secret laboratory. He worked relentlessly, driven by a singular, desperate purpose. He mixed batches of micronized iron oxide, essentially a very specific type of fine rust powder, with industrial epoxy resins. He ground graphite into a fine dust and blended it in, adjusting the proportions by the gram. He tested different particle densities, different curing times. Using scrap steel plates he procured from the shipyard, he would apply a sample, let it cure, and then test it with a sensitive magnetometer he'd borrowed. He was searching for a recipe, a specific chemical signature that could make a mountain of steel invisible to a magnetic sensor. And then, one night, hunched over a steel plate under the single bare bulb of his garage, he found it. It was extraordinary. When he applied his special paint mixture at a thickness of roughly 1/8 of an inch, the measurable magnetic field at a distance of nearly 100 feet was reduced by a staggering 76%. 76%. It was nearly double the effectiveness of the Navy's complex degaussing coils, which cost $15,000 per ship to install. His paint? It would cost about $1 for every 10 square feet of hull. He didn't write a fancy scientific paper. He wrote a 14-page technical report in plain, direct language, the language of a craftsman who knew his materials. He simply explained what he had done, why he believed it worked, and how much it would cost. He included his raw test data, attached physical samples of the coated steel plates, and requested a meeting with the Naval Sea Systems Command, which is how he found himself in that conference room. A lone civilian facing a wall of military brass, with the fate of thousands of sailors resting inside a single can of gray paint. Admiral Thompson picked up Morrison's homespun report. He scanned it for 90 seconds, his expression unreadable. Then he placed it back on the table with a soft thud. "Mr. Morrison, I appreciate your initiative," he said, the words carefully chosen. "But you are proposing we paint the bottom of United States warships with an unproven, experimental concoction based on garage experiments. Do you understand that if your paint fails, hundreds of sailors will die?" Morrison met the Admiral's gaze without flinching. "With all due respect, Admiral, hundreds of sailors are already dying. My mixture works. My tests prove it. I just need 48 hours and one test vessel to prove it to you on a full scale." Another officer, Captain Richard Hartley, the Navy's chief materials engineer, interjected. "Morrison, even if your mixture works in a lab, applying it to a ship's hull is a different world. It needs to adhere in salt water. It needs to withstand hydraulic pressure. It needs to remain effective through months of naval operations. Have you tested any of those factors?" Morrison nodded slowly, prepared for the question. "Yes, Captain. I submerged my test plates in salt water for 6 weeks. I subjected them to thermal cycles simulating naval operations from the Arctic to the tropics. I tested them against accelerated corrosion. The paint maintains its electromagnetic properties, and as an added benefit, it provides superior anti-corrosion protection compared to the standard naval coating." A silence fell over the room. The officers looked at each other. This was unexpected. This wasn't just a crackpot theory. This was methodical work. Admiral Thompson glanced at Captain Hartley, who was now poring over Morrison's data tables. Hartley looked up, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The numbers were solid. Too solid to ignore. Thompson made a decision. The lives being lost every day in the Atlantic weighed on him more than the risk of ridicule. 48 hours, Mr. Morrison, he declared. "We'll give you the destroyer escort USS Mason for your test. If your paint works, We will evaluate full-scale production. If it fails, this conversation never happened. Is that acceptable? A wave of relief washed over Morrison, but his face remained a mask of professional calm. Acceptable, Admiral. 2 days later, on June 15th, 1943, at 6:15 in the morning, the real work began. At Pier 7 of the Brooklyn Navy Yard, the USS Mason, D-529, an Everett-class destroyer escort, sat in dry dock, its nearly 300-foot hull exposed to the air. Morrison and a hand-picked crew of 8 civilian painters from the yard stood ready. The paint they were about to apply was nothing like they had ever worked with before. It was dark gray, almost black, with the thick, viscous consistency of molasses. The smell was sharp and penetrating, a chemical cocktail of epoxy resin and graphite. This wasn't a job for rollers and brushes. This was a meticulous, scientific application. It was the paint that hid an entire fleet. The mixture had to be applied in a precise, uniform layer, exactly 1/8 of an inch thick. Any thinner, and it would lose its electromagnetic dampening effect. Any thicker, and it risked cracking under the thermal stress of ocean travel. Morrison personally supervised every square foot of the application. He moved along the scaffolding, checking the thickness with calipers, ensuring the coverage was perfectly even. He knew that a single missed spot, one small patch of uncoated steel, could emit enough of a magnetic signature to wake a German mine. The entire process was a grueling, nonstop marathon that lasted 31 hours. The team didn't sleep. Morrison least of all. With every stroke of the trowel, he saw his son's face, imagined his ship sailing through the treacherous waters of the North Atlantic. Every minute counted. At 1:20 p.m. on June 16th, the final section of the hull received its coat. Morrison stepped back, exhausted but satisfied. The USS Mason was now completely encased in his special mixture. It sat there, dark, matte, and featureless, looking almost like a ghost ship. Now came the test. The morning of June 17th, 1943, broke clear and calm off the coast of New Jersey. The USS Mason sliced through the gentle swells, heading for the Sandy Hook Naval Proving Ground. On board, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Morrison stood on the bridge, his hands gripping the railing so tightly his knuckles were white. Admiral Thompson was there, along with a dozen naval engineers and intelligence officers, their faces grim and watchful. They were sailing towards a specially prepared test zone where the Navy had laid 6 captured German LMB magnetic mines. The mines had been disarmed, their explosive charges replaced with sensitive electronic sensors that would register an activation signal without detonating. The test plan was brutally simple. The USS Mason would sail within 75 feet of each mine, well inside the standard 100-foot detonation range. If Morrison's paint worked, the sensors would remain silent. If it failed, the sensors would light up, a clear signal that under real-world conditions, the entire crew would have been killed. The ship's captain, Commander William Blackford, gave the order. All ahead 1/3. Steer course for target Alpha. The destroyer escort moved forward at a steady 8 knots. Below deck, engineers watched the electronic monitors linked to the mines. On the bridge, no one spoke. The only sounds were the hum of the engines and the soft wash of the sea against the hull. Approaching target Alpha, a voice called out. Range 100 feet, 80 feet. Morrison held his breath. 75 feet from the first mine. The ship was directly over the target location. The electronic sensors remained dead silent. No activation. Range 50 feet, the voice continued. Still nothing. The USS Mason passed directly over the German magnetic mine, so close they could have seen its menacing shape if the water were clearer. The sensors registered nothing. The mine would not have detonated. A single, collective exhale seemed to ripple across the bridge. But the test was far from over. Commander Blackford calmly ordered the ship towards the second mine, then the third, then the fourth, fifth, and sixth. Each time, the destroyer passed well within the kill zone, sometimes as close as 60 feet. And each time, the result was the same. The mines remained dormant, blind to the thousands of tons of steel gliding silently above them. Zero activations. Zero detonations. At 11:47 a.m., the test concluded. Admiral Thompson stared at the final report from the engineering team. 6 out of 6 mines had failed to detect the USS Mason. 100% effectiveness. He turned, his face no longer a mask of skepticism, but one of profound respect. He extended his hand to the civilian painter. "Mr. Morrison," he said, his voice filled with a gravity that a simple handshake could not convey. "You just saved American lives." He turned to his aide. "Authorize immediate production." But Morrison had one more question. "Admiral, how many ships can we coat?" Thompson consulted with his officers. They made rapid calculations. Paint availability, production capacity, the number of ships currently operating in high-risk zones. "We have 89 transports and destroyer escorts in the North Atlantic routes right now," Thompson announced. "If your paint can be produced in sufficient quantity, we could have them all coated within 6 weeks." Morrison nodded, his mind already shifting from invention to logistics. "I can scale production. I need access to industrial suppliers for iron oxide and epoxy resin, and I need authorization to share the formula with civilian industrial coatings manufacturers." "Authorized," Thompson said without hesitation. "Do whatever it takes." Morrison didn't waste a second. By 8 a.m. the very next morning, he was sitting in a boardroom in New York City with executives from 3 of the largest coatings companies in the country: Pittsburgh Plate Glass, Sherwin-Williams, and DuPont. He gave them the complete formula. No patents, no royalties, no restrictions. "We need 47,000 gallons of this paint in 5 weeks, he stated plainly. "Can you do it?" The response was immediate and unanimous. The full might of American industry was mobilized for war. Production began on June 20th. 3 industrial plants began operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, churning out Morrison's recipe. Every gallon was tested, inspected, and shipped directly to naval yards in Brooklyn, Norfolk, Charleston, and San Francisco. Teams of civilian painters worked in 12-hour shifts, meticulously coating the hulls of destroyers, transports, and Liberty ships. By July 28, 1943, all 89 of the most at-risk Allied vessels were sailing the Atlantic, wrapped in Morrison's shield of invisibility. The real test had begun. In mid-August, the first reports trickled in. The destroyer USS Bowery, coated in the new paint, sailed directly through a known minefield off the coast of Iceland, an area where 4 Allied ships had been sunk in June. It passed without incident. The transport SS James B. Weaver crossed the heavily mined English Channel. 0 detonations. The destroyer USS Champlain escorted a supply convoy through waters north of Scotland, a kill box containing at least 23 confirmed German magnetic mines. It survived without a scratch. One after another, the coated ships sailed through waters that had once been death traps, and the German mines lay silent. U.S. Naval intelligence began tracking the data. Between August and December of 1943, the 89 coated ships completed a total of 1,347 crossings through known magnetic mine zones. The number of ships lost to magnetic mines? 0. The intelligence analysis revealed something even more remarkable. Naval engineers recovered fragments of German mines that had failed to detonate and discovered that the fuses had registered a magnetic anomaly. But the signature from the coated ships was so weak, so faint, that the mine's own circuitry had dismissed it as a natural fluctuation in the ocean's magnetic field, not a valid target. Morrison's paint hadn't just hidden the ships. It had taught the mines to ignore them. In December, a classified report landed on the desk of the German Naval High Command in Berlin. It noted an inexplicable failure rate of their LMB mines in the North Atlantic. Their expected detonation rate was 34%. The observed rate had plummeted to just 7%. The Germans, baffled, assumed their mines were faulty. They ordered modifications, increasing the sensitivity of the magnetic sensors. It made no difference. The problem wasn't their engineering. The problem was that the Allied ships were no longer speaking a language their minds could understand. By June of 1944, on D-Day, the ultimate test arrived. As the largest amphibious invasion force in human history crossed the English Channel towards the beaches of Normandy, over 400 of the Allied ships were protected by Morrison's paint. The Germans had sown the channel with over 6,700 mines, many of them the deadly magnetic LMBs. Naval analysts had projected that, based on mine density and the sheer volume of traffic, at least 38 invasion ships would be sunk by magnetic mines in the first 3 days. The actual number of ships lost was 4. The paint was saving lives on a scale that not even Morrison himself could have imagined. The final accounting came in July of 1945, after the war in Europe was over. A classified report from the Naval Department of Operational Analysis laid out the staggering numbers. Over 2 years, 416 ships coated with Morrison's paint made 8,234 transits through confirmed minefields. Number of coated ships sunk by magnetic mines, 0. The number of ships that would have been sunk or crippled without the paint was estimated to be 234. The number of sailors aboard those ships was approximately 34,000. A father, working in his garage to protect his son, had ended up saving a small army. On August 12, 1945, a week after the end of the war, James Morrison received a letter from the Department of the Navy. It wasn't a medal or a formal commendation. It was something far more personal. It was a list of 147 names. They were the names of merchant mariners who had written to the Navy asking who had developed the coating that had saved their lives. Men who simply wanted to say thank you. Morrison's eyes scanned the list, his hand trembling slightly. And then he saw it. Junior Lieutenant Robert Morrison. His son's ship, the SS John W. Brown, had been coated with his father's paint in July of 1943. It made 23 more Atlantic crossings, navigated 6 confirmed minefields, and survived every one. His boy had come home. Morrison folded the list and placed it in a drawer in his desk. He never showed it to anyone. The program remained classified until 1958. He returned to his job as an industrial painter at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, quietly working until his retirement in 1961. When he passed away in 1967, his obituary in the New York Times mentioned he was a dedicated civil servant of the war effort. It never mentioned the 34,000 lives he saved. The principles he discovered in his Brooklyn garage, however, live on. The advanced electromagnetic signature-reducing coatings used on modern Arleigh Burke-class destroyers and nuclear submarines are a direct technological descendant of the paint mixed in a garage by a man who refused to accept that a problem was impossible because he was a father who just wanted his son to come home alive. What do you think of this incredible untold story? Did you know that a civilian painter played such a critical role in the Battle of the Atlantic? Smash that like button if you believe in the power of American innovation, and subscribe to uncover more hidden secrets of World War II. We bring you these verified, fascinating histories every